Kelly was a deeply private, self-contained and controlled person. That was the Kelly that I found. He was the product of a fatherless family, which was a rare thing, certainly a rarer thing than it is today, in an area that could still consider itself religious. He was not fatherless because he was bereaved. He was fatherless because his father joined the Air Force, then a glamorous occupation during the war, and remarried and started another family, from whom he was estranged almost his entire life. And those include the relatives of his father that lived in his hometown. His mother, on the other hand, seems by all accounts to have had some sort of personal trouble, and she ultimately committed suicide while David was at university. David Kelly was, for the most part, brought up by his very elderly grandparents. I spoke to his school friends in Pontypridd. I say school friends. Most of the people he was at school with didn't know they'd been to school with him. They'd been watching him on the headlines. They'd been watching him on telly when he was in front of the Foreign Affairs Select Committee, and didn't realise that they'd been to school with him until I rang them to find out what he was like.
David Kelly was the sort of person that no one would ever have heard of had it not been for what happened in 2003 with the Iraq War and the alleged weapons of mass destruction. He was an unsung hero in many ways, did a great deal to tackle weapons of mass destruction across the world. He uncovered what was in the Soviet Union in the 1990s. He was sent to Iraq after the 1990 war. He was highly valued by the United Nations and indeed by Porton Down, where he was an advisor. And before his death, he was probably going to be awarded a knighthood to go with another honour he'd received, a Cross of Michael and St George from the Queen.
I first became suspicious that there was a kind of falsehood in connection with the Iraq War before war started. I was brought up in a military background, and I was always taught that the MI6 was a wholly admirable, honourable at any rate, organisation, who were ultimately driven by integrity. I find it impossible, therefore, to understand or think that they could be telling lies. And so I assumed there must be some truth in the claims about WMD. It was when what followed in the aftermath of the invasion, it soon became obvious that there weren't WMD, and therefore had there been a terrible mistake, or had somebody been telling untruths before? That was the question we had to think about. And you didn't think that MI6 was incompetent, or just fools or charlatans. You felt that these were capable people. So for me, it was profoundly shocking about the British establishment that it was capable of coming up with this farrago of nonsense. I assume that these are capable people, and they have all been trained to assess information. And how did they come to the conclusion that Saddam Hussein possessed WMD? My view is that something terrible happened to MI6, which caused it to betray its heritage as an organization of integrity.
I think it's well established now that the intelligence agencies were put under massive pressure to find some sort of intelligence, any intelligence, that could justify the actions, the preconceived and predetermined actions of the Blair government to stand shoulder to shoulder with the USA in invading Iraq. Now, we know as well that there was a deal cut between Blair and George W. Bush when Blair went to visit Bush at his Texan ranch in April 2002. And Blair basically promised, from what we know now, that he would make a case to take the UK into war. So that, of course, became known as the Coalition of the Willing, or Coalition of the Killing. So the pressure, I think, was immense. We've had reports from people coming out of military intelligence and Ministry of Defence saying that their considered professional viewpoints were ignored. And I think looking at what happened with David Kelly is that his professional viewpoints were being ignored as well. He had been an inspector in Iraq. There had been no trace of chemical weapons. He knew that. And yet, this concept of WMD was forced up into the forward, it was forced into the executive summary of the document that was put in front of Parliament. It was very much sexed up. He knew it, and he knew that it would redound badly to his professional reputation, and probably to a number of other people as well.
I don't understand why Richard Dearlove still has his knighthood. He was the head of MI6 at the time, and the damage he did to that service is so grave because he caused people not to believe what they say or do. And they were believed up until 2003. They had great credibility. And so when the government made these statements to the House of Commons and through the dossiers, there were two of them actually, that the intelligence services are telling him that WMD existed. Well, one was inclined to give this statement by the Prime Minister great credibility when he cited MI6 as saying something. And of course, when it emerged that they didn't exist, you have to ask what had been going on. Had it been that there was some great catastrophic error of judgment at MI6, or was there was the Prime Minister lying? But even if the Prime Minister was lying, he should have been called out. There should have been a challenge from MI6 saying, look, you're sexing this up or you're making false statements. You would expect them to get in touch with Downing Street, who they were very close to at the time, and say, look, you can't make these statements, you should withdraw them.
I think the whole notion of an invasion of Iraq in the wake of 9/11 came as a huge surprise to the entire intelligence community in the UK. I mean, everyone knew that Saddam Hussein had more to fear from al-Qaeda insurgents within his own country, a bit like Colonel Gaddafi of Libya had the same problem too. So for America to suddenly skew the focus away from where the terrorists actually came from, Saudi Arabia, to a country that actually feared those same group of terrorists, which was Iraq, was a very cynical move indeed. And to see then the hyping up of a very flimsy and indeed fake intelligence case was one incredibly appalling to view as a concerned UK citizen, but also considering the pressures that my former colleagues would have been under, was painful. I mean, can you imagine? You are there to gather intelligence, to assess it, and then to make recommendations to your political mass, to the government of the day, to inform their policy making, and to come to them and say, this is our community's view and overview about what we assess to be going on in Iraq, and then to be told, go away and make a better case. Suddenly, I think that a lot of them would have realised that they were not independent advisors to the government of the day. They had become complicit, and that would have been upsetting to a number of people, I think, on the inside.
You have to remember back in 2002, 2003, there was a wish by George Bush for regime change. That's what was driving him. Nothing to do with weapons of mass destruction, which of course didn't exist in Iraq, but a desire for regime change. And Tony Blair was signed up to this fully. And Alistair Campbell's diaries, if we can believe those, back in 2002, he had an entry which says that in April 2002, regime change was what it was about. So this was, of course, quite illegal. So they had to construct some sort of formula, some sort of cover story, in order to persuade the British public that intervention in Iraq was right. Now, David Kelly, as an expert in weapons of mass destruction, knew that this was untrue. He knew that there were probably no weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, and he also knew that the case the government was putting out to the public was laced with exaggerations, laced with untruths in many cases. And it was the fear, I think, that a weapons of mass destruction expert in David Kelly and a respected organisation like the BBC was going to pull the rug from under this tissue of lies being put to the British public by Alistair Campbell and by Tony Blair. It's very clear that Tony Blair and George Bush had decided to go to war by the middle of 2002, despite what Blair said later, which was he decided in March 2003. And in order to convince the public that this was necessary, they had to construct fake intelligence to feed to Parliament and to the public at large. These were the dodgy dossiers, and they were designed not to present intelligence as it is and in a fair and balanced way, but to be sexed up to present a case for war. The September 2002 dossier was partly rewritten by Alistair Campbell. Why is it that number 10 press secretary can be involved in writing intelligence dossiers, but he was, and he strengthened the language in many cases to make it look more like a threat from Saddam Hussein rather than the doubtful, careful wording that had been provided by the intelligence department itself. And of course that contained the infamous 45-minute claim, which was subsequently shown to be rubbish and was, by the way, withdrawn on the day David Kelly was found dead. If that wasn't enough, then in February 2003 out came another dossier, and this turned out to be Nicked Off the Internet, written by Mr. Al-Marashi. So there was no lengths, or no depths I should say, which the government wouldn't go to try and convince the public that war was necessary.
I was actually visiting my parents in Monterey when I got an email from a scholar at Cambridge, Glenn Rungwala, asking had I written the most recent British intelligence report. And I asked him, what intelligence report are you talking about? It was thereupon he sent me an email with the British intelligence report and said, look after the introductory paragraph. Look how similar the document is to your article of September 2002. I compared both documents, and when I originally read, I first started with the British intelligence report. Even though it was my own language, I didn't recognize it. I didn't even, in fact, recognize I had been plagiarized, because not only had I published that article several months earlier, but I had written so much in the meantime on my thesis, I had even forgotten what I had written. And I have to give credit to Glenn Rungwala for not only having read my article perhaps in September 2002, but then having looked at the British intelligence report a couple of months later and recognizing the similarities. He's the one who pointed it out. I was at home when he sent me that email. I responded to him saying I had no role in writing the British intelligence dossier. In other words, plagiarism has occurred. I confirmed that for him. And then I went to sleep. While I was sleeping, he was sending an email to his various contacts, saying, "Look what the British government has just done." And it was Channel 4 News that picked up that story.
The government's carefully coordinated propaganda offensive took an embarrassing hit tonight after Downing Street was accused of plagiarism. The target is an intelligence dossier released on Monday and heralded by none other than US Secretary of State Colin Powell at the United Nations yesterday. Channel 4 News has learned that the bulk of this 19-page document was copied from 3 different articles, one written by a graduate student.
So, in preparing this intelligence dossier, it was a cut and paste job, and what gave away the fact that I had been cut and pasted was that even my typographical errors, even a misplaced comma in my original article made it into the British intelligence document. And if there was kind of one clue that said beyond any doubt that this was a cut and paste job, it was that misplaced comma. And ironically, now that I've gotten very good at the use of commas, but ironically, my misuse of commas has been immortalized in a book called Eats, Shoots, and Leaves, where Lynn Truss, on her very final page, concludes, why is the use of commas important? Remember the case of Ibrahim al-Marashi's misplaced comma that gave away the British government's plagiarism of his work. So that was an indication of what was cut and pasted without any changes. Then what you had was a cut and paste, but editing a few select words to make the document more terrifying, more damning of the Saddam Hussein government. And the key word was this. I had written that Iraqi security services have aided opposition groups in hostile regimes. So in other words, if there's an Iranian opposition group to the Islamic Republic of Iran, of course the Iraqi government would give it help. They changed opposition groups to terrorist groups. And that is a very important distinction, and which I would have never used. You see, the other rationale behind the US invasion of Iraq, or I should say the Anglo-American invasion of Iraq, was that Saddam could potentially give weapons of mass destruction to terrorist groups like Al-Qaeda. When you change the wording to terrorist groups, then you've taken the document and fit that narrative of Iraq working with terrorist groups like Al-Qaeda. Now, neither government said it explicitly. It was kind of communicated by association. Now, remember, this is the US 2 years after 9/11. And so for the American audiences, that was a powerful narrative to sell the war, that Iraq could potentially collaborate with Al-Qaeda by giving them weapons of mass destruction.
After February 2003, when it became clear to everybody that the government was now plagiarising material from the internet to justify its case for war, that meant that the role of the weapons inspectors, both internationally, and Hans Blix and indeed David Kelly in this country, became more important. They were going to be the neutral voices. But the neutral voices, of course, were not saying what the government was saying. They were saying something rather different. And therefore, they had to be smothered in some way, or discouraged, or discredited if necessary. And that's what happened with David Kelly. David Kelly was the expert in this country who could have proved very decisively that what the government was saying was untrue and exaggerated.
As the case for war ratcheted up, US intelligence were also keen to distort any information it received to push the case for war. Its golden egg came in the form of one Rafid Ahmed Alwan al-Janabiya, otherwise known as Agent Curveball, a former Iraqi chemical engineer who sought asylum in Germany in 1999. He was quickly recruited by German secret intelligence, who, after much deliberation, became increasingly wary of the veracity of the information they were receiving from their prized asset. The US was less concerned and was eager to deploy whatever information it could to skew the narrative in order to remove Saddam. In an off-the-record interview with the Observer newspaper, David Kelly challenged US intelligence that they'd found evidence of mobile biological laboratories in Iraq. They are not mobile germ warfare laboratories, Kelly said. You could not use them for making biological weapons. They do not even look like them. They are exactly what the Iraqis said they were: facilities for the production of hydrogen gas to fill balloons. Facilities which, incidentally, had been sold to the Iraqis by the United Kingdom. Of all the evidence compiled about Saddam Hussein, the accusations about germ warfare had been the most compelling. Curveball had provided this evidence, despite German misgivings to the contrary. Despite reservations to the authenticity of this false intelligence, the director of the CIA, George Tenet, pressed ahead. The stage was now set.
The United States reserves the right to do what it thinks is appropriate to defend its interest, the interest of its friends, and to protect the world. And I'm quite confident we'll be joined by many nations.
My fellow citizens, at this hour, American and coalition forces are in the early stages of military operations to disarm Iraq, to free its people, and to defend the world from grave danger. On my orders, coalition forces have begun striking selected targets of military importance to undermine Saddam Hussein's ability to wage war. These are opening stages of what will be a broad and concerted campaign. More than 35 countries are giving crucial support, from the use of naval and air bases to help with intelligence and logistics to the deployment of combat units. Every nation in this coalition has chosen to bear the duty and share the honor of serving in our common defense.
The release of Andrew Gilligan's report on Radio 4's Today programme caused immediate ructions in the government. In an interview with Channel 4 News, Alistair Campbell was vociferous in his condemnation of the BBC's role in the affair.
Get your facts right before you make serious allegations against government and against intelligence agencies.
One fact is absolutely incontrovertible, and that is that the second dossier, the dodgy dossier, was indeed just that. And the last question...
I have acknowledged.
But you've not acknowledged...
I have admitted... Let me just draw this contrast between myself and between the government and the BBC. On Wednesday, at that select committee, I acknowledged we had made a mistake. I accepted responsibility for that on behalf of the the official in my office who made the mistake.
That is all a part of... That's a matter of record.
Can I finish the point? The BBC, I'm all in favour of senior management defending...
I want to ask you one last question, because I don't think we're going to clarify...
The media furore around the affair caused Kelly to write to his line manager at the Ministry of Defence, Dr. Brian Wells. In the letter, he made it clear that he was not the source of the 45-minute claim in the dodgy dossier, and this was accepted by the MOD. However, Parliament's Foreign Affairs Committee had been taking a keen interest on the pace of events that were unfolding.
In the period leading up to the Iraq War, the Foreign Affairs Select Committee began extensive probing of the Foreign Secretary and intelligence operators and former ambassadors as to the scale of the threat presented by Saddam Hussein and what the response should be. And certainly we were very anxious that at every stage the United Kingdom should exhaust all the avenues open to it to minimise the prospect of conflict and to reach some reconciliation with Saddam. And that would have gone right up to the 11th hour. But I think also what was happening is that members of Parliament were being increasingly told by HMG, Her Majesty's government, that the threat was immediate and grave. And so I think many of us concluded, we factored in the fact that governments might exaggerate the case, that intelligence isn't 100% accurate, it's not an exact science, but we never countenanced that what we were being told in the broad brush terms was a total lie. And it's only after the event, after the tragedy of the Iraq War, that the gravity and scale of the deceit has become fully apparent and aware to us. But at that time, we were doing everything we could to persuade and cajole the government to exhaust all avenues to avoid conflict. Well, my recollection is that as soon as hostilities finished, there was a presumption by us all that there would soon, within hours perhaps, be revealed laboratories or placements deep in the desert which would show that there were weapons of mass destruction under construction or almost ready to be deployed. I mean, one assumed that. And I think the believers in Her Majesty's government assumed that. And we certainly had the Foreign Secretary Jack Straw before us, who was saying, we will find them, we will find them. And after a little bit of time, you think, well, when are we going to be shown on British television these weapons of mass destruction? When is it going to be disclosed to us? The day of the committee arrives, there's a packed committee room. There's a lot of tension amongst members, the journalists are there. In came Dr. David Kelly, escorted by two minders who sat immediately behind him. I felt for him that he, obviously it was not a particularly pleasant set of circumstances, that he would be nervous, but he also struck me as reasonably self-assured. And after all, this was his opportunity to amplify upon the fact that it was alleged he had spoken to journalists saying that the United Kingdom government had exaggerated the case for war. So although there were time limitations which I think were outrageous, if he had been invited to amplify upon this, we could have done it within this time constraint. But what happened was an inability or unwillingness of him to reply to questions.
Can you tell me those journalists who you do recall having met in the timescale, what are their names?
Having met?
Yes.
I've met very few journalists.
Well, yes, I heard few. But who are the ones who are in your mind's eye at this moment? What's their names?
That will be provided to you by the Ministry.
No, I'm asking you now. This is the High Court of Parliament, and I want you to tell the committee who you've met.
On this occasion, I think it's proper that the Ministry of Defence communicates that to you.
Despite my frustration and irritation that he hadn't responded to my simple question, what journalists have you spoken to, he persuaded me that he'd been basically set up by the government to stall and to diminish the extent of the committee's probing. And it was at that stage I turned to the colleague sitting to my left and said, what is the stuff which is pushed out of jet aircraft to deflect attacking missiles?
No. I reckon you're chaff. You've been thrown up to divert our probing. You ever felt like a fall guy? I mean, you've been set up, haven't you?
That's not a question I can answer.
But you feel that?
No, I accept the process that's going on. I'm sorry, I accept the process that's happening. Thank you.
Thank you.
Mr. Hamilton, please.
That was misinterpreted by people as a sort of an insult, but I was using a term which a weapons expert, which he was, understood. I was angry, but not with him. I was very angry with the British government. I thought they'd again got away with avoiding disclosure as to how we had, as a parliament and people, been tricked into going into a war and conflict with all the consequences and gravity of that. I thought that they got away with it again.
Foreign Affairs Select Committee, that parliamentarian briefing, I think that was an indignity to him. And I think it also cost him as a great deal as a future interrogator. I think what it heralded in practical terms was the end of Kelly's capability as an interrogator, because you cannot interview people as he did in foreign countries if you've already been grilled on television before your own parliament. So I think that would have been objectionable to him in the extreme, in that that process cut him off at the knees when it came to dealing with WMD scientists in foreign countries, particularly Iraq.
On Thursday, the 17th of July, Dr. Kelly woke at 8:30 a.m. By 9 a.m., he was at his study, writing and checking emails from the day before. At 10 a.m., he spoke to his colleague, Wing Commander Clark, by phone, who found him to be in good spirits. They discussed his next trip to Iraq, where his ticket was scheduled for 8 days later, on the 25th of July. This was to carry on with his duties, supporting the Iraq Survey Group, the mission sent to find weapons of mass destruction. After writing a number of emails, he replied to another, written by Judith Miller, a New York Times journalist, and someone Dr. Kelly had known for some years. In her message, she congratulated him for his display at the Foreign Affairs Committee. Her message read, "I heard from a member of your fan club that things went well for you today. Hope it's true. Jay." At 11:18 a.m., Kelly replied, "Judy, I will wait until the end of the week before judging. Many dark actors playing games." Shortly after 3 p.m., at 3:20 exactly, on the 17th of July, 2003, Dr. David Kelly left his house in the Oxfordshire village of Southmoor to go for one of his regular walks. His wife Janice had retired to bed 2 hours earlier after feeling ill. He didn't say goodbye or leave a note. Within 15 minutes of leaving, he exchanged pleasantries with a neighbour as he passed. She was the last known person to see David Kelly alive. When her husband failed to return a few hours later, Janice Kelly began to feel unease, eventually sharing her concerns with her youngest daughter, Rachel, who had organised to go for a walk with her dad later that evening. Following attempts to retrace her father's steps, she made contact with her 2 sisters, one of whom drove 70 miles from her house in Hampshire, and after a number of hours searching, they made the decision to call the police just before midnight. Within 15 minutes, 3 officers arrived at the family home. This was not standard practice. By this point, Dr. Kelly had not been seen for almost 9 hours. As the police hunt swung into action, more than 40 officers, a police dog, a police helicopter, a mounted police unit, and an underwater police search team scoured the area for any signs of the missing doctor. Tony Blair received the news as he was flying from Washington to Tokyo. At 4:45 a.m., Mrs. Kelly and her 2 daughters, Rachel and Shan, were asked to stand in the family's garden while officers searched their home for the second time. At 7:30 a.m., a search pattern was established and where officers were asked to begin combing a wider area. At shortly before 8:30 a.m., Thames Valley Police publicised Dr. Kelly's disappearance. At approximately 8:45 a.m., searchers Paul Chapman and Louise Holmes discovered the body of Dr. David Kelly at Harrowdown Hill. The discovery was logged at 9:20 a.m. Tony Blair was informed of the death by his advisor, Sir David Manning, who was also on the flight to Tokyo. And in an extraordinary turn of events, the Prime Minister ordered a public inquiry sometime between 10 and 11:05 a.m. before the cause of death had even been declared. At 2:35 p.m., the delegation arrived in Tokyo to awaiting reporters.
Have you got blood on your hands, Prime Minister? Are you going to resign over this?
The public inquiry was to be headed by the former Lord Chief Justice in Northern Ireland, Lord Hutton. Hutton was a controversial figure who was involved in a number of contentious legal cases during the Troubles. In 1973, he represented the Ministry of Defence at the inquests of 13 innocent civilians murdered by British paratroopers in what is since known as Bloody Sunday. In 1978, he helped defend Britain in the European courts against Irish government allegations that prisoners held by the British in Northern Ireland were tortured. Even more controversially, he sentenced 10 men in 1984 to a total of 1,001 years in prison on the word of an acknowledged informer, Robert Quigley, who was given immunity from prosecution in return for his evidence. 2 years later, he acquitted one Nigel Hegarty, an RUC police reservist, who had shot dead a protester, John Downes, at a range of about 3 yards. The young man had been running towards a group of armed officers with a stick when he was shot. Mr. Hegarty did not testify, but Lord Hutton helpfully concluded that he acted probably almost instinctively, and that his actions were not unreasonable, given the stress of the moment and the obvious determination of the deceased and his stick. In a case that received greater attention than state killings in Ireland, in 1991, Lord Hutton successfully led a public campaign to overturn a 3-2 majority decision taken by the UK's highest court to approve the extradition to Spain of the former Chilean dictator Augusto Pinochet on torture charges. Blair's choice of Hutton seemed to imply a man that could do the bidding of the establishment.
The Hutton inquiry, let's just talk about that. The word inquiry implies a proper legal process with rules and procedures which can be followed and which people have confidence in. This was not an inquiry of that nature at all. It was barely an inquiry at all. You have to remember that Dr. Kelly was found dead in unexplained circumstances on Harrowdown Hill. And what happens in this country, and should happen in this country, is that there should be a coroner's inquest. That's what should happen. A coroner's inquest following specific rules, open to the public, where witnesses are called to give evidence under oath. They can be recalled, and the standard of proof applies there as it does in a court. In other words, in order to reach a verdict of suicide, you have to be convinced, or the coroner does, beyond reasonable doubt. Well, of course, the Oxfordshire coroner began his proper inquiries leading up to an inquest. And what happened? He was bundled off the case. Bundled off by a politician in the Blair government, Lord Falconer. And if you bundle someone off an inquest and replace it with Lord Hutton's inquiry, what does that tell you? Because Lord Hutton's inquiry was not statutory. It had no official legal basis. Nobody was compelled to give evidence. Nobody could be convicted of perjury. No standard of proof for Lord Hutton's conclusions were necessary. Key witnesses such as the leading police officer investigating the death of David Kelly and Mai Pedersen, his best friend, who had a great deal to say to me when I spoke to her, they weren't called to give evidence. And when people did give evidence in the Hutton inquiry, they were by and large shut up.
Hutton was an inspired choice for the purposes for which he was to serve, which was to achieve a whitewash. Now, Hutton had presided over a series of quite controversial trials in Northern Ireland, and I think as a consequence he was familiar with the process of talking to special branch officers and intelligence officers and accepting, shall we say, non-court evidence from them. And I think that was exactly what happened with his inquiry. And I think that also, the case in point is DC Graham Coe and the two unidentified people who were the first people, supposedly, to search the body. Hutton talked about them in a very evasive way. It was clear, I think, if you read the testimony, that Hutton did not want any of those people identified, and he only mentioned them in the first place because he knew he had to, because the searchers had seen them. Hutton was happy to glide over things, I dare say, because of Hutton's personal faith in the state.
We were given the Hutton report the day before. It was published, and then it got leaked by somebody, not us, certainly, to the Sun. But we got it the day before, and we sat and read it, and I sat and read it with the head of news and the deputy head of news, and we all just sat there and said, guys, we've been fucked, haven't we? Completely fucked. But actually what happened was he went too far on their side, and no one believed it. One always remembers the Independent that day, the blank front page with just the word whitewash.
There's no question that Hutton went too far. I think even Downing Street were embarrassed by the extent of Hutton's bias. But he did what he was supposed to do, which was clear the government and point the blame somewhere else.
Well, what was interesting is if you looked at the whole coverage of, first of all, the war and then the Gilligan affair and then Hutton, trust in the BBC never wavered in the polls. Trust in the government went like that. So the public believed us, I think, and they didn't believe the government of the day. And as you say, sitting here many years later, it's very hard to find anyone who now supports the government's position on Iraq.
Well, I was drawn into a tiny group over the Christmas of 2003, and the more I read, the more I studied, the more I became very concerned about the lack of truth, all the omissions and all the lies. For instance, was the cell phone of Dr. Kelly triangulated and the movement of that phone recorded and analysed, which would have proven suicide if they wished to prove it. As you know, I understand, cell phones emit a signal. I can give you 20 seconds or something. So the antennae pick up those signals. It is possible to know where the phone is accurately. So if he had gone for a walk from his home in Southmore up to Harrowdown Hill and sat there for about 8 hours before he took his life in the way described, they would have known that the phone moved that distance of about a mile, which I have walked with Miles Goslet on one occasion. There was blood at the scene. There was talk about droplets of blood on the nettles, I think, around the corpse. There was the stain of blood on his right knee, 50p piece, it was said, and some blood around his left wrist, on his left wrist. And that would have been rather less easy to fake, I think. If the first cause of death, according to my Lord Hutton, was of bleeding out, he would have had to have lost something like 4 pints of blood.
I'm John Scare, and I trained at the Middlesex Hospital and then University College Hospital in surgery. I became a vascular surgeon, and I practiced for most of my career at University College Hospital. And that's involved really operating on arteries and veins. And I've operated on them for the aging diseases such as atheroma, but a lot of my work has been involved with trauma, arteries that have been damaged, cut with knives, etc. I was asked to get involved by a journalist who was curious about the fact that you could die from simply cutting a small artery in your wrist. And it was the ulnar artery. There are 2 arteries in the wrist. There's a bigger one, which is the one that people usually cut to commit suicide, and the smaller one. And from that moment on, it became quite clear that there are a lot of facts that didn't add up. I was told that he'd committed suicide, and that he'd committed suicide by cutting the ulnar artery. I was asked if I'd ever seen that, and the answer is I have never seen somebody die from an ulnar artery injury. I looked through the literature, and it's exceedingly rare. To do that, you would have to put a tourniquet around your arm, you'd probably have to be in a bath of hot water, but more importantly, you'd have to lose most of your circulation, and that would involve losing about 5 litres of blood, which would make a large mess or a large puddle. Now we know there was no large puddle of blood found at the site, which makes it highly unlikely that he died at that site from an ulnar artery injury. The other curious thing is, he was right-handed, would have held the knife in his right hand. It was his left wrist that he cut. And I don't know whether I can demonstrate, but the radial artery runs down this side, the ulnar artery runs down that side. If you take a knife and cut your wrist, what you do is you cut through the radial artery, not the ulnar artery. If somebody else was doing it, i.e. they were standing on that side, then they would cut the ulnar artery rather than the radial artery. So these inconsistencies made me slightly concerned about how he actually died. We know from the post-mortem that he had some paracetamol tablets, but 2 paracetamol tablets in your stomach is not going to kill you. We know he had some heart disease. Again, no evidence that that caused his death, but people do drop dead suddenly from heart disease. So there are a large number of unanswered questions. And for me, as a doctor, if Nicholas Gardner had actually continued his inquest, he opened it and then adjourned it, we might have got some of the answers.
One of our fellow workers, he is a pharmacologist, a medically qualified pharmacologist, and he has said that the concentrations reported by Dr. Allen at the laudable Hutton inquiry would have been relevant to ingestion of 2 carproxymal tablets. In other words, the concentrations were low. I pointed out in my own writings on global research under David Halpin's website, global research website, that there were 5 specimens taken by Dr. Hunt. One was from the heart, which is not a good place to take it anyway, and that was described at the Hutton inquiry by Dr. Allen. He also described, I think it was called NH44, and that blood contained no dextropropoxyphene, the depressant drug, the analgesic, or paracetamol. So one of the 5 specimens, this is why the cross-examination never took place. There was the toxicologist and the pathologist Hunt were never cross-examined by experts in that field. So their evidence, which is faulty anyway, I can say that quite directly, was never properly examined. And in fact, our colleague, Dr. Michael Powers, QC, has pointed out that of the 21 days of hearing, only 1/2 of one day was spent on discussing the forensic aspects. That is disgusting.
In investigating the strange death of Dr. Kelly, many anomalies have continued to arise. In the weekend immediately following his death, Dr. Kelly's dentist, Dr. Canas, arrived at the Oak Street dental practice in Abingdon on the Friday morning when it was announced that the eminent scientist was missing. And before midday on that day, discovered that his dental records were gone. In a peculiar turn of events, the records reappeared a few days later, on the 20th of July. On Monday, the 21st of July, all surgery staff, plus the builders, had their fingerprints taken by police. The only identifiable prints left on the records belonged to Dr. Kelly's hygienist. Despite the fact that Dr. Canas believed the records had been missing, and despite there being 6 unidentified prints on the records, the police concluded there was no sign of a break-in at the surgery. There's also the question of no fingerprints found on any of the items that were in the presence of Kelly when he was found at Harrowdown Hill. These included a knife he allegedly used to kill himself, a water bottle that was allegedly used to swallow pills, some empty pill packets, a watch, a pair of glasses, and a mobile phone. And yet, when his body was found, he wore no gloves. This was never even mentioned at the Hutton inquiry. The evidence of paramedics also concluded that there wasn't a lot of blood near the body when it was found. This runs contrary to the official recording of how Dr. Kelly died. Among other urgent questions that remain unaddressed are why a factually contentious death certificate for Dr. Kelly has been produced, why incomplete evidence concerning his whereabouts during the last week of his life was given to the Hutton inquiry, why certain witnesses were not called to give evidence to the Hutton inquiry, and why a police search helicopter with thermal imaging equipment, which flew over the wood where the body was found, did not detect his body, despite the fact his body temperature was warm enough at the time to register on the helicopter search system. In the event of all of this, why are all medical and scientific records relating to the scientist, plus photographs of his body, locked away for 70 years? In May 2006, Jeff Hoon, the Defense Secretary who oversaw the Ministry of Defense's treatment of Dr. Kelly shortly before his death, was so furious about being removed by Tony Blair as leader of the House of Commons that he wrote a resignation statement. In it, he planned to make a speech about the Kelly affair. He told friends that could trigger the instant downfall of the Prime Minister. What did he intend to reveal?
The fact that my country, since 9/11 to the very present, continues to bleed is painful. As somebody connected to Iraq, what I found was the US removed Saddam, and in his place came somebody almost worse, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, the caliph who was killed. The so-called caliph who was killed. He's dead. I don't know who's going to replace him. And so for me, it's this kind of continuum of pain and agony and of course, I can't even imagine what it is like for the Iraqis who do have to stay in those conditions, or even the relatives I have who will also stay there. But for me, it's when you come from the country, it's not who rules that matters. It's the agony that the people go through. The Iran-Iraq War. Then came the sanctions. Saddam was removed, then you had the Civil War, then you had ISIS. Then you have protests that are happening right now calling for jobs, electricity, reliable water. And even having gone to Iraq, I understand their frustration. Having lived through the conditions, I could barely survive there 2 weeks. I can't imagine what it is for an Iraqi to live there. A lot of us are wistful, or are having now kind of a revised nostalgia. And the nostalgia goes to whichever period you're harken back to. Some have nostalgia for the monarchy. Some of us have nostalgia for the time of when the first Iraqi republic was established under a general named Abdul Karim Qasim. And of course, there's this dumb nostalgia. And all that nostalgia is understandable because it seems from 1980 to the present, it's been this kind of continuous period of agony. Iraq just does not seem to have caught a break in all of this.
It started in, the Blair era started in such hope. It appeared to be a wonderful compromise between the old-fashioned socialism and John Major's dog-eared and moth-eaten government, as we all saw it at the time, and there was a very hopeful moment. You can argue, and its supporters would do so, that the Blair government was a period of great prosperity as a whole for Britain. Great investment in public services, and that Mr. Blair's ministers were public-spirited individuals. What scars it is the Iraq War, more than anything else. And that is where there are still many unanswered questions, but we know for certain that it caused mayhem and countless deaths in the Middle East.
I think the rush to go into Iraq in the teeth of all available evidence, also in the teeth of a lot of evidence pointing to Saudi Arabia as being the country of the funding and of the terrorists involved in 9/11. I think it was incredibly reckless, and it was done for reasons which had nothing whatsoever to do with Al-Qaeda, with 9/11, but everything to do with a sort of neoliberal think tank type advice coming out of America at the end of the 1990s and early 2000s. Where a paper was produced called Rebuilding America's Defenses. And this basically listed ways of securing US hegemony across the Middle East, securing energy supplies, of course, and securing the petrodollar monopoly, which underpins the limited viability now of the American economy. And 5 countries are named as targets for taking out or for a regime change. So it's easy enough to guess. Iraq, Syria, Libya, Iran, and North Korea. Now, looking at where we are now, almost 20 years on from the Iraq War, which other countries are still standing? Libya's been taken out, Gaddafi's been taken out, and we see the appalling humanitarian consequences of that, as well as the refugee crisis for Europe. They had a good go at Syria, but of course that was propped up by the Russian intervention as well. They're certainly saber-rattling now to try and go into Iran. This seems to be the last country standing out of the Middle Eastern countries. And of course we know that North Korea is seen as a threat, but that has certain deterrents, which some of the other Middle Eastern countries did not have. So it's frightening watching that sort of fall of the dominoes coming on, all based on policy that came out of the American neoliberal government in 1999. So I think there is a pattern there. I don't think it's random. And Iraq was the first unfortunate country in the crosshairs. And David Kelly was just yet more collateral damage from all these American-led wars.
What exactly is my thesis as to the cause of his death? It is highly likely he was assassinated. There was good motivation for that, because he was speaking out of turn. And in the inquiry into his death, particularly the oblique inquiry through the unlawful inquiry of Lord Hutton, no evidence has come forward to suggest anything else.
The events of 2003 were disgraceful ones in this country's history, and its unfinished business. Those responsible for an illegal war, those responsible for the death of David Kelly, have not been brought to justice. There's been no inquest into David Kelly's death. There needs to be one. We need to make sure that those who behaved in a reprehensible way in 2003 are finally brought to book.
In August 2017, 14 years to the month after David Kelly had been buried in a churchyard at St Mary's Longworth, one final peculiarity arose. In the dead of night and without any witnesses, the body of the eminent scientist was exhumed, his headstone also removed. Neither the St Mary's Parish Church, the Ministry of Justice, the Oxfordshire Coroner, the nearest crematorium, or the Diocese of Oxford were prepared to comment. Each said the exhumation had been a private family matter. Just one more of the many anomalies in the strange death of Dr. David Kelly.